What if I told you that the luxurious interiors of the Victorian era were not designed for living, but for slowly freezing to death? We are used to seeing cozy living rooms with roaring fireplaces on old postcards where ladies and gentlemen enjoy comfort. However, the reality hidden behind velvet curtains and gilded frames was permeated with cold, dampness, and a constant struggle for warmth. Majestic mansions with their high ceilings and huge windows turned into stone traps in winter, trapping the icy air inside. The elite of society, despite their vast fortunes, were forced to live in conditions that today would be considered unfit for habitation. Their daily lives consisted of endless attempts to keep warm using methods that were of little help. Behind the beautiful facade lay a life of physical discomfort and shivering. Watch the video to the end to find out how the simple routine of washing in the morning turned into a real polar expedition without even leaving the bedroom. Are you ready to learn the truth about why famous Victorian houses were ideal machines for cold torture? The main problem with these majestic buildings was the very material from which they were constructed. The brick and stone that made up the walls had an amazing ability to accumulate cold and retain it for months. Without proper insulation, these walls acted as giant cold accumulators, drawing heat from any living creature. Even on sunny winter days, the temperature inside a mansion rarely rose above 10 degrees Celsius. The humid climate of foggy Albion only exacerbated the situation, saturating the masonry with moisture. The huge windows, of which the architects of that era were so proud, served as the main gateways for the icy wind. Single glazing in the wooden frames provided virtually no barrier to the outside air. The gaps in the frames were so large that the heavy velvet curtains fluttered even when the windows were closed. Cold air flowed down the glass, creating a constant draft at floor level. Standing near a window in winter was equivalent to standing outside without a coat. No shutters could completely seal these openings. High ceilings, considered a sign of status and wealth, became a curse in winter. All the warm air that managed to be created inside the room inevitably rose, accumulating where no one was. The people below remained in the cold air zone, shivering from the piercing chill. To warm up such volumes even a little, a huge amount of fuel was required, which was always in short supply. The space above their heads was warm, while the residents' feet literally froze on the parquet floor. It was physics working against the comfort of the inhabitants. The layout of the houses also contributed to the constant cooling of the living areas. Long enfilades of rooms with wide doorways created ideal conditions for drafts. Opening the door to one room inevitably sent a wave of cold air into the next. Corridors and stairwells often had no heating at all. Moving from the bedroom to the dining room was like running across an icy desert. Doors rarely closed tightly, leaving gaps for air to move through. The floors in these mansions were most often covered with wood or tile, which cooled instantly. Even expensive Persian rugs did not save from the cold coming from the basement. Wind often blew between the floorboards, penetrating through the ventilation holes in the foundation. The feet were the most vulnerable spot and had to be kept on benches or cushions at all times. Walking barefoot was absolutely out of the question and was considered a sure way to catch a cold. The cold penetrated through the soles of indoor shoes, causing the toes to go numb. The front doors of the mansions opened directly into spacious halls that had no vestibules. Every visit by a guest or messenger was accompanied by a rush of cold air into the house. This cold instantly spread up the stairs to the upper floors. Butlers and footmen were forced to stand in the draft to greet visitors. The hall was the coldest place in the house, but it was there that one had to take off one's outer clothing. This was the first test that anyone entering had to face. The lack of central heating meant that the heat was patchy and uneven. One part of the huge hall could be relatively warm, while 3 meters away you could see your breath. The walls bordering the street were frozen through, covered with condensation or frost on the inside. Furniture could not be placed close to the outer walls to prevent it from becoming damp and covered with mold. Residents huddled in groups in the center of the rooms, away from the icy perimeter. The whole house felt like a huge stone bag. Ventilation in Victorian houses was designed so that fresh air came in through cracks and chimney flues. This provided oxygen, but completely blew out all the accumulated heat. Attempts to plug the cracks with rags or paper were considered bad form and a sign of poverty. The elite had to endure the hardships of the climate stoically, without resorting to such tricks. Fresh air was valued above thermal comfort. The house breathed, but its breath was icy. Dampness was a constant companion of the winter season in London's stone houses. The wallpaper in the corners of the rooms often peeled off, and the fabrics became damp to the touch. Bed linen had to be specially dried before bedtime, otherwise it was dangerous to health to lie down in it. Books in libraries were covered with a coating of mold, and the leather upholstery of armchairs became sticky and cold. This damp cold penetrated clothing much more effectively than dry frost. It settled in the bones and did not let go until spring. Even the wealthiest aristocrats could not change the laws of thermodynamics in their homes. Architectural fashion dictated its own rules, which ran counter to climatic realities. The beauty of the facades and the grandeur of the interiors were paid for by the constant discomfort of the inhabitants. The house, which was supposed to be a fortress, became an icy dungeon, and no amount of gold could make these walls retain heat. I wonder how this topic is perceived in different parts of the world. Where are you from? Do you agree with the arguments presented, or do you think that beauty requires sacrifice? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Guess how much heat that luxurious fireplace actually provided. In the Victorian era, the fireplace was a symbol of the hearth, the center of family life, and the main source of heat. However, its efficiency was appallingly low, at only about 10 to 15%. Most of the heat generated by burning coal literally went up the chimney with the smoke. The fireplace only heated objects and people that were in close proximity to the fire. As soon as you took a couple of steps away, the cold enveloped your body again. The design of an open fireplace created a powerful draft that sucked warm air out of the room. To maintain combustion, the fire needed a constant supply of oxygen. This air was sucked in from all the cracks, from under the doors and windows, creating constant drafts. The result was a paradoxical effect. The more the fireplace was stoked, the colder it became at the feet. People found themselves trapped between the scorching heat in front and the icy draft behind. This was called roasting your face and freezing your back. Coal, which was used as the main fuel, was a source of constant dirt and dust. Fine coal dust settled on furniture, carpets, clothes, and the faces of the inhabitants of the house. Servants had to constantly clean the fireplace grates and remove the ashes, raising clouds of soot. Chimneys required regular cleaning, otherwise they would become clogged and start to smoke inside the room. The smell of burning and coal dust was an integral part of the winter atmosphere, even in the wealthiest homes. Special fireplace screens were used to retain some of the heat. They protected ladies from excessive heat, which could melt the wax on their faces or ruin their makeup. The screens also helped to redirect some of the heat radiation deeper into the room. These were beautiful, often embroidered interior items that served a purely utilitarian function. But even they could not compensate for the shortcomings of an open hearth. The size of the fireplace often did not correspond to the size of the room it was supposed to heat. Monumental portals were installed in huge ballrooms or long galleries, but their heat was only enough for a small radius. In the far corners of the room, the temperature could be 10 degrees lower than at the fire. The water in vases of flowers standing by the window could be covered with a thin crust of ice overnight. In winter, the living space was reduced to a small area in front of the fireplace grate. Lighting the fireplace was a complex and laborious ritual that began long before the owners woke up. The maid had to come to the cold room at dawn, clean out the ashes, and light a new fire. If the coal was damp or the draft was poor, The room would fill with acrid smoke. The owners had to wait under their blankets until the temperature in the bedroom rose at least a little. Fireplaces often went out during the day and had to be relit. Firewood was used less often as coal was cheaper and provided more heat, but its quality varied. Cheap coal contained a lot of sulfur and produced a yellowish, smelly smoke that stung the eyes. Wealthy people bought select anthracite, but even that did not solve the ventilation problems. In damp and windy weather, the smoke could be blown back into the room, covering everything with a layer of soot. This made it unbearable and harmful to the lungs to stay indoors. There was a whole system of accessories for maintaining the fireplace: tongs, pokers, scoops, and coal buckets. All of them were made of metal and were often works of art. However, the need to constantly add fuel made the heating process a continuous chore. If you missed the moment, the fire turned into a pile of smoldering coals that gave off no heat. The life of the room depended on the rhythm of feeding the insatiable furnace. The mantelpiece was the warmest place in the house. So important little things were always kept there. Gloves were dried there, letters were warmed before reading, and clocks were placed there so that the mechanism would not freeze. But even standing close to the fire, one could feel the movement of cold air around them. It was a warmth that had to be fought for with every gust of wind. The illusion of comfort was shattered by the harsh reality of physics. Ultimately, the fireplace was more of a beautiful decoration than an effective heating device. It created atmosphere, but could not provide a stable temperature. The elite were hostages to tradition, which dictated that every room should have an open fire. Heat was a privilege that had to be constantly maintained by hand. Have you ever wondered why characters in old novels so often faint by the fireplace? You will learn how they tried to warm themselves with water in the next chapter. Want to know a secret that will change your perception of aristocratic cleanliness? The morning toilet of a Victorian gentleman or lady was a feat that required considerable courage and willpower. In the absence of hot running water, washing was done with a jug and basin placed on a table in the bedroom. Overnight, the water in the jug cooled down so much that by morning it was covered with a thin layer of ice. Before washing, this ice had to be broken, and the sound of cracking ice was the first sound of the new day. For a full bath, a so-called sitting bath or hip bath was used. It was a small metal trough into which only a little water was poured. Servants brought hot water in jugs from the kitchen, which was often located in the basement or another wing of the house. By the time the water was carried through the cold corridors and staircases, it had cooled down considerably. As a result, bathing was not a relaxing procedure, but a quick attempt to wash away the dirt in lukewarm water. The very process of undressing in an icy room caused shivering and a desire to get dressed again immediately. People stood on a small rug in front of the fireplace, trying to catch a few crumbs of warmth. The naked body instantly became covered in goosebumps from contact with the cold air. Soap did not lather well in cold water, leaving an unpleasant film on the skin. Every minute of delay threatened hypothermia. The sponges used for washing were natural and became hard as stone when dry. In cold water, they remained unpleasant to the touch and scraped the skin. Feeling a draft with a wet body was doubly painful. Therefore, the method of wiping was popular when individual parts of the body were washed in turn without undressing completely. This allowed you to at least somehow retain body heat under the layers of your nightshirt. Towels, even if they were linen and expensive, always seemed damp in a damp room. They tried to hang them as close to the fireplace as possible so that they would warm up a little before use. It was necessary to dry off vigorously and quickly in order to get the blood flowing and warm up through friction. Often, the maid would hold the towel by the fire until the moment it was needed by the master, but the warmth of the fabric evaporated in a matter of seconds. Washing their hair was a real problem for women with long hair in winter. It took several hours to dry thick hair without a hairdryer in a cool room. Walking around with a wet head was dangerous. It was a direct path to meningitis or pneumonia. Therefore, they washed their hair extremely rarely, limiting themselves to combing and using powder. Hair cleanliness was sacrificed for the sake of health. Toothbrushes with natural bristles did not dry out in the dampness and became a breeding ground for bacteria. The water for rinsing the mouth was icy, which made the teeth ache and the jaws clench. The procedure of brushing teeth required overcoming the pain from the cold. Many preferred to wipe their teeth with a cloth dipped in brandy or a special solution. This was more pleasant than contact with ice-cold water. Shaving for men was also risky and uncomfortable. The foam quickly cooled on the face, and the cold steel of the dangerous razor irritated the skin. Hands trembling from the cold increased the risk of cuts. Hot water was worth its weight in gold, and every drop was cherished. Often men shaved every other day or grew beards, which also warmed the face a little. Going to the toilet was a particular challenge, as it often consisted of a chamber pot hidden in a bedside table. Sitting on cold porcelain or metal in an unheated room was extremely unpleasant. The contents of the pot had to be taken out, which added to the workload of the servants and the discomfort of the owners. The advent of the first water closets did not greatly improve the situation, as the water in the cisterns could freeze. Hygiene in the Victorian winter was not a pleasure, but a harsh necessity. Cleanliness required suffering and physical endurance that was inaccessible to pampered natures. People lived in a constant compromise between the desire to be clean and the fear of freezing. Water was an enemy that had to be tamed and warmed. Like this if you're glad you have a hot shower. What if I told you that fashion was another sophisticated way to freeze people? The Victorian wardrobe, despite its many layers, was often completely inadequate for protecting against the cold indoors. Women's fashion dictated the wearing of dresses with low necklines and short sleeves for evening outings. Bare shoulders and arms were exposed to the drafts that swept through dining rooms. Thin fabrics such as muslin, silk, and gauze were prized above all else, but they provided no more warmth than paper. To compensate for the lightness of their outer garments, ladies wore an incredible amount of underwear underneath. A shirt, corset, pantaloons, and several flannel or wool petticoats created a cocoon. However, this cocoon only protected the lower body, leaving the upper body vulnerable. Wool stockings were a lifesaver, but no one was supposed to see them. Aesthetics demanded an elegant silhouette, which did not go well with warm clothing. Men also suffered from the demands of etiquette and fashion. Their shirts were made of thin linen or cotton, which cooled the body at the slightest moisture. Starched collars and cuffs were stiff and cold, cutting into the neck. Frock coats and tailcoats were made of woolen cloth, but often had no warm lining. The waistcoat was the only item that actually kept the torso warm. Footwear was a separate chapter in the Book of Winter, suffering for the aristocracy. Women's shoes were made of thin leather, satin, or velvet with the thinnest soles. Such shoes were intended for parquet floors, but these floors were icy. The cold instantly penetrated through the soles, causing the toes to go numb after just half an hour. Warm boots or felt boots were considered coarse peasant clothing, unacceptable in the salon. Shawls, stoles, and capes were not just accessories, but means of survival. Ladies wrapped themselves in them at every opportunity, removing them only for the most solemn moments. Cashmere shawls cost a fortune, but they really did keep the shoulders warm. However, etiquette strictly regulated when and where one could be seen wearing a shawl. It was considered bad form to sit at the table wrapped up. Gloves were worn even indoors, not only for fashion, but also for warmth. Thin leather or silk protected the hands from direct contact with the cold surfaces of furniture and railings. They were only removed for eating or playing the piano. Touching the icy keys of the instrument was a challenge for young ladies. Their hands would turn red and peel from the constant temperature changes. Home clothes, robes, and morning gowns were warmer and more comfortable. They were made of quilted fabrics, velvet or thick wool, but such clothes could only be worn in one's bedroom or in the narrow circle of family. Receiving guests required changing into formal armor, which did not keep one warm. The life of the elite was a constant changing from warm to beautiful. Children were also not spared from the fashionable torture of the cold. They were dressed in short pants and dresses, leaving their knees exposed. It was believed that this strengthened their character and body, but in reality it led to constant colds. Woolen socks and gaiters were a must, but they often slipped down. Children's fashion copied adult fashion in its impracticality. At night, they wore long nightgowns and nightcaps. The head was the only part of the body that remained outside the blanket and had to be protected. Woolen socks for sleeping were the norm even for the most sophisticated dandies. The bedroom was the coldest place at night, and clothing was the last line of defense. Thus, the clothing of the Victorian elite was more of a social marker than protection from the environment. It demonstrated status, taste, and the ability to sacrifice comfort for beauty. Layers of fabric created the illusion of protection, but the cold found a way through any outfit. Do you think you could endure a social gathering in such attire? You will find out how they moved around the house without turning into ice cubes later on. Moving around a Victorian mansion in winter was like going into outer space without a spacesuit. The corridors and halls connecting the living rooms were almost never heated. They were buffer zones filled with stagnant, icy air. Moving from the warm living room to the dining room required mental preparation and physical effort. People tried to run through these spaces as quickly as possible, holding their breath. The drafts in the corridors were incredibly strong and penetrating. They whistled under the doors, burst out of the stairwells, and roamed the long galleries. The flame of a candle in the hand of a passerby flickered from side to side, threatening to go out. Shadows danced on the walls, creating an ominous atmosphere. This wind was an internal enemy living in the heart of the house. The staircases were particularly treacherous due to the chimney effect, where cold air descended and warm air rose. The railings were icy to the touch, and it was unpleasant to hold them without gloves. The stone or marble steps drew heat through the thin soles of one's shoes. Climbing the stairs meant overcoming the resistance of dense, cold air. The corridors were often unfurnished, which intensified the feeling of emptiness and cold. The bare walls, decorated only with paintings, did not retain heat. The sound of footsteps echoed through the space, emphasizing the loneliness of the walker. No one lingered in these areas to talk. All communication took place behind the closed doors of warm rooms. The hallway was just an obstacle to be overcome. The drafts under the doors were so strong that they had to be blocked with special rolls. These long sausages, stuffed with sawdust or wool, were placed under each door. They were called draft snakes and were an essential part of the winter interior. Without them, the floor of the room was so cold that your feet froze instantly. It was a primitive but necessary ceiling measure. The lighting in the corridors was dim, which visually intensified the feeling of cold. Gas lamps or rare oil lamps provided little light and heat. Dark corners seemed even colder than they actually were. Psychologically, the darkness and cold merged into a single hostile space. One felt small and vulnerable in these huge passageways. Servants, forced to spend a lot of time in corridors and stairwells, suffered from the cold the most. They had to carry heavy trays of food or coal, unable to quickly cross the dangerous area. Their uniforms were often not warm enough for such conditions. Working in the corridors was a severe test for the health of the staff. Opening any door into the corridor was accompanied by clouds of steam and a sharp drop in temperature. Rooms lost their accumulated heat instantly as soon as someone entered or left. Therefore, etiquette required closing doors behind you as quickly as possible. Those entering always brought a trail of cold with them, for which they could be met with reproachful glances from those present. The passages between different wings of the house could be even colder, sometimes even below freezing. In some mansions, there were underground passages for servants, which were damp and chilly. Life in the house was divided into isolated islands of warmth in an ocean of cold. The continuity of space was disrupted by climatic barriers. These corridors of death were the inevitable price to pay for the scale and grandeur of the architecture. They reminded the inhabitants that nature was very close, just outside the door. The house was not a single warm organism, it was an archipelago of survival. What if I told you that a dinner party could cause serious illness? Victorian social life did not stop even in the harshest frosts. Dinner parties and balls required strict dress codes that took no account of the temperature indoors. Ladies in open dresses were forced to sit at the table for hours, pretending to be relaxed. They hid their blue lips and trembling hands behind fans and smiles. It was almost impossible to heat the huge dining rooms, even when the fireplace was burning at full power. The table was set in the center of the room, far from any sources of heat. Guests found themselves in the coldest area, surrounded by icy air. The backs of those seated were exposed to the drafts blowing through the hall. The food on the plates cooled at an incredible speed. Soup poured from a hot tureen turned into a lukewarm slurry by the time the footman brought it to the guest. The fat on the meat froze into a white crust, making the dish unappetizing. The cooks came up with complex sauces and presentations, but the cold killed the taste of the food. Guests had to eat quickly, forgetting their manners, in order to swallow at least something warm. The silver cutlery and porcelain dishes were icy to the touch. Holding a fork or knife with frozen fingers was uncomfortable and sometimes painful. The metal drew the last of the warmth from their hands. The napkins, even when carefully starched, felt damp and cold. Conversations at the table were often interrupted by coughing or sneezing, which people tried to stifle. They tried to hide the tremor in their voices with small talk and laughter. The wine, which was supposed to be at room temperature, was often too cold. Champagne could even cause a spasm in the throat. Under the table, there was a whole other, invisible life going on. Guests tried to rub their feet unnoticed or wrap themselves in the long tablecloths. Some brought small foot warmers with them, hidden under their fluffy skirts. It was a little secret for surviving high society. The servants serving the dishes had to work in white gloves, which helped to protect their hands a little. But standing motionless by the wall waiting for orders was torture. Their uniforms did not include warm undergarments. The footmen were often ill, but there was no one to replace them. The end of dinner and the move to the living room were seen as a salvation. There, in a closer circle and closer to the fireplace, it was finally possible to warm up. But the way from the dining room lay through those very cold corridors. Dinner was not a gastronomic delight, but a test of endurance. Social gatherings in winter were a test of endurance. Those who could maintain their grace and wit when their teeth were chattering were considered true aristocrats. The cold was a filter that weeded out the weak. Was etiquette worth such torment? You will find out how they survived at night when the candles went out. Nighttime in a Victorian house was the most frightening time of day. With the onset of darkness, the houses became quiet, but this silence was deceptive. When the last candles went out and the fireplaces died down, an icy darkness rapidly descended inside. The walls, frozen throughout the day, began to release their cold into the air. The furniture became as icy as stone. It felt as if the house itself was breathing frost. When the lights went out and the last heat from the coals disappeared, the temperature in the bedrooms dropped to incredible levels. No luxury could stop the cold that penetrated every crack. At night, the air became so dense and cold that it seemed almost tangible. Sometimes clouds of steam rose from people's breath, as if they were outside rather than inside the room. This steam settled on fabrics and furniture. It served as a reminder of how thin the line was between comfort and freezing. The temperature in the bedroom could drop to 0 or even below, especially in large brick houses. The cold accumulated near the floor and walls. The water in a glass on the table turned to ice faster than the owners could wake up. Often by morning, the liquid had become completely solid. People had to deal with this almost every night in winter. For them, it became a common occurrence. By morning, the water in the glass had turned into a real ice cylinder. The owners sometimes showed it to guests as proof of the harsh climate inside the house. The breath of sleeping people turned into thick frost on the sheets. This was especially noticeable when a person woke up. Their breath formed cold clouds of steam. Sometimes the blanket was covered with a thin layer of frost. It looked beautiful and scary at the same time. Beds with canopies and thick curtains were not just a fashionable whim. They served as a protective barrier, like a small room within a room. The drawn curtains retained heat and helped a person warm their own space. Without them, a person was completely exposed to the damp air of the bedroom. Thus, the canopy became a vital element of the bedroom. It was part of a survival system. By drawing heavy curtains, people created a small, warm refuge. The curtains on the bed were thick and heavy to retain heat for as long as possible. They blocked drafts that could seep in even through closed windows. Many canopies were made of velvet or thick tapestry. These materials did not allow air to pass through, creating a soft vacuum of warmth inside. The bedroom was transformed into a series of separate cocoons, where everyone sought refuge in their own way. Before going to bed, it was essential to warm up the bed. Otherwise, it was simply impossible to lie down. An icy sheet could cause shivering in seconds. To avoid this, special warmers were used. They were heated on coals or by the fire, then carefully passed over the sheets. This helped to remove dampness and prepare the place for sleep. Only then could a person lie down. Copper or brass hot water bottles with long handles were used for this purpose. Such items were common in all walks of life. The maid carefully warmed every corner of the bed so that the cold would not penetrate the body. Sometimes hot water bottles wrapped in flannel were used as a substitute. They were placed at the feet so that the heat would last longer. This brought relief at least in the first minutes of sleep. It was unthinkable to lie down in an icy bed without thoroughly warming it up. Even the bravest tried to avoid this ordeal. People knew that the body lost heat in seconds as soon as it touched the cold sheets. Therefore, the process of preparing the bed was an important part of the evening ritual. It took time, but it allowed you to fall asleep faster. Without it, the night would be unbearable. Sometimes there were up to 10 blankets on the bed. Wool, down, cotton wool. Anything that could retain heat was used. Under their weight, a person literally sank into sleep, almost without moving. Blankets not only warmed, but also pressed against the body, reducing heat loss. Such weight could be uncomfortable, but it helped to survive the frost. Especially popular were feather beds into which the body sank. Feather beds served as a soft and warm base where heat was retained for hours. Air hardly circulated under them, which protected people from drafts. Sometimes feather beds were so deep that people had to exert themselves to get out of them. But it was this design that saved them at night. The mattress provided additional protection from the cold air coming from below. It was one of the best heat insulators of the time. A nightcap was a must-have for everyone. It protected the head, which remained the most vulnerable part of the body. A long cap could be wrapped around the neck, creating an extra layer of protection. Women wore bonnets that fit snugly over their ears. The ears and nose were always the first to get cold. Therefore, headwear was not a luxury, but a necessity. The head was the only part of the body sticking out from under the blankets, and it was the part that needed warmth. Without a cap, hair would become covered in frost. The nose and cheeks could literally go numb overnight. Therefore, people paid special attention to covering their heads. The warmth retained inside the bed dissipated too quickly. A cap helped to retain it. The bedroom walls were so cold that it hurt to touch them. Condensation appeared on the paintings, and the mirrors were covered with a frozen film. Getting out from under the blanket at night to relieve oneself seemed like a feat. The cold immediately enveloped the body, and one wanted to get back as quickly as possible. Many preferred to endure until morning. The bed was the only refuge. Any movement disturbed the microclimate inside the bed, and the warmth immediately disappeared. People knew that the slightest opening of the canopy could let in the icy air. Therefore, nighttime awakenings were rare. At night, no one talked or got up unless absolutely necessary. It was a quiet, tense sleep, but there was no other choice. In the morning, ice patterns bloomed on the windows, striking in their beauty. They covered the glass with a layer that made it difficult to see anything. To look outside, you had to breathe on a small hole or warm a coin. The ice lasted for hours, even when the fireplace was already lit in the room. This showed how cold it was at night. The morning began with a battle against the frost. Clothes taken off in the evening became ice cold overnight and sometimes damp with condensation. In the morning, they put them on with disgust, feeling the cold in every fold. Servants brought warm clothes, but they cooled down before their owners had time to get dressed. This added to the torment. The cold haunted people from the moment they woke up. Warmth could only be achieved after a long struggle by the stove. The bedroom was a place of struggle for survival and sleep. Every night became a small test, a test of readiness for the cold. People knew they would wake up from the cold air pinching their faces. Nevertheless, they continued to live like this year after year. It was a familiar reality, and every dawn was a small victory over the elements. All the comforts of the Victorian elite rested on the shoulders of an army of servants, whose work in winter became backbreaking. They were the invisible mechanisms that sustained life in the icy house. Their day began before dawn, in the coldest and dampest rooms of the house, the kitchen and the cellars. Their first task was to light the kitchen stove, the heart of the home, to heat water for their masters. Carrying coal was endless and hard work. Buckets full of black fuel had to be carried to all floors and all living quarters. The maids, often young girls, carried heavy loads up steep stairs dozens of times a day. Their hands were black from coal dust and red from the cold. Coal was heavy, dirty, but a vital load. Servants usually lived in attics, under the roof, where there was no heating at all. In winter, the roof froze, and the temperature in the servants' rooms was the same as outside. The water in their jugs froze completely. They slept covered with old coats and rags, huddled together for warmth. No one cared about their suffering. It was considered normal for their position. Cleaning the fireplaces was dirty and harmful work. Raking out the ashes, cleaning the grate, rubbing it with graphite until it shone. All this was done on their knees in a cloud of dust. Soot ate into their skin and clothes, causing coughing and lung disease. Chimney sweeps, often children, risked their lives cleaning narrow chimneys. Washing clothes in winter was hell. Water was heated in huge boilers, and the laundry room was filled with steam, which immediately condensed on the cold walls. The laundress's hands were constantly in water and in the cold, and their skin cracked until it bled. There was nowhere to dry the laundry, so it hung for weeks in damp basements, acquiring a musty smell. The servants had no right to complain about the cold. They had to look neat and work quickly. The butler in the hall was not allowed to wear a coat when greeting guests. The footmen on the carriage's rear wheels froze in the wind while the owners sat inside. Their bodies were a tool for ensuring the comfort of others. It was the servants' labor that created the thin layer of warmth in which the elite lived. Without their constant running around with coal, water, and hot water bottles, life in the mansion would have come to a standstill within an hour. They were living batteries, burning their health for the sake of their master's warmth. This class difference in the perception of cold was enormous. For the masters, the cold was a discomfort. For the servants, it was a mortal threat and a source of endless work. Winter exacerbated social inequality to the limit. The Victorian era was characterized by a strange medical theory about the benefits of fresh air and the harm of stale air. Doctors claimed that stagnant air in a room was a breeding ground for miasmas and diseases. Therefore, even in the most severe frosts, the windows in bedrooms and nurseries were often kept ajar. Ventilation was considered an essential hygienic procedure, more important than warmth. It was believed that sleeping in a heated room was harmful to health and complexion. Cold air supposedly hardened the body and strengthened the lungs. Children were deliberately put to bed with the windows open, despite their coughs and runny noses. It was a cruel manifestation of care based on the misconceptions of science at the time. Fear of carbon monoxide from fireplaces and gas lamps also encouraged constant ventilation. Ventilation was primitive, and opening a window was the only way to quickly change the air. People chose between the risk of suffocating and the risk of freezing, and more often chose the latter. Drafts blowing through the house were perceived by some as a sign of a healthy atmosphere. "The air must move," said the housewives, wrapping themselves in shawls. Tightly closed windows were considered a sign of Philistinism and unsanitary conditions. An aristocratic house had to be blown through by all the winds. This obsession reached absurd levels in educational institutions and boarding schools. The temperature in the pupils' bedrooms was kept at a Spartan level. Complaints about the cold were perceived as a weakness of character. A whole generation grew up accustomed to sleeping in freezing rooms. Tuberculosis, the scourge of the time, was treated with cold, fresh air. Sanatoriums for consumptives were verandas where patients lay wrapped up in the cold. This practice also penetrated private homes. A sick family member could be kept in the coldest room for recovery. The paradox was that in striving for health through cold, people often contracted pneumonia and bronchitis. But the connection between cold in the home and illness was often ignored in favor of the theory of miasms. Fresh, frosty air was considered clean, while warm indoor air was considered dirty. As a result, cold in the home was not only a consequence of poor architecture, but also the result of a conscious choice. It was an ideology of cold, elevated to the rank of medical virtue. The elite froze not only because they couldn't keep warm, but also because they thought it was the right thing to do. The advent of the first plumbing systems in Victorian homes brought not only comfort, but also new, previously unseen problems. Pipes were laid without thermal insulation, often along exterior walls or in unheated attics. At the first serious frost, the water in the pipes turned to ice, expanded, and burst the metal. This led to real disasters inside wealthy mansions. A burst pipe meant not only the cessation of water supply, but also flooding during the thaw. Icy water flooded expensive carpets and damaged plaster and furniture. Ceilings collapsed under the weight of wet lime. The house became uninhabitable in a matter of hours. Plumbers were the most sought-after people in winter, awaited as saviors. But repairing the system in the cold was difficult and expensive. Often, floors and walls had to be torn open to get to the site of the accident. Repairs turned a cozy home into ruins. To prevent freezing, servants were ordered to leave the taps slightly open so that water would flow constantly. But this did not always help and led to enormous water wastage. Sometimes the pipes were wrapped in rags or straw, which looked shabby in luxurious interiors. Frozen drains and sewers were an even bigger problem. The inability to use the toilet took the palace residents back to the Middle Ages. The smell from the non-functioning sewage system penetrated the living quarters. It was humiliating for people accustomed to comfort. Water tanks installed on roofs to create pressure froze to the bottom. They had to be warmed up manually by lifting buckets of hot water up there. It was dangerous work on a slippery roof. Often, the tanks simply cracked, leaving the house without a water supply. Gas pipes also suffered from condensation, which froze and blocked the gas supply. The lights went out at the most inopportune moment, plunging the house into darkness. The owners had to return to candles and oil lamps. Technical progress was powerless in the face of the elements. Winter accidents became the main topic of conversation and complaints in letters. "We have another burst pipe in the library," was a typical phrase from the correspondence of that time. The struggle with the water supply was an annual battle that people often lost. Ultimately, technology outpaced the ability to operate it competently. Homes were filled with conveniences that were not designed for the climatic realities. The elite became hostages to their own desire for progress. Comfort proved as fragile as ice in a pipe. We have seen that the life of the Victorian elite in winter was far from the fairy tale images. Gold and velvet could not protect them from the piercing cold, and huge mansions became icy traps. Wealth gave them status, but did not guarantee basic warmth. Their daily life was a struggle for survival in conditions that would seem unbearable to us today. Perhaps looking at your modern radiator, you will begin to appreciate it a little more. Do you think you could survive even one winter in such conditions? Write in the comments what topic you would like to see in the next video, and subscribe to the channel.